Hello, and welcome to Engineering with Rosie Live. Um, Let me know in the comments that you can see and hear us okay, because I always get nervous that I'm talking to no one or that you can't hear me, so please reassure me. So, in today's live stream, we're going to be looking at a highly renewable energy grid simulation and talking to the creator, Dave Osmond, about the results and the implications. So, we've got Dave here. Hi, Dave.
Hello.
So I'm going to introduce David properly in a second, but first I'm keen to hear from you in the comments where you're watching from, and I also put up the poll question that I posted ahead of time on YouTube, LinkedIn, and Twitter. How much storage duration do you think Australia would need to get to 99% renewable electricity? So that's pretty vaguely phrased, I know, but we'll get into the details of the question and of Dave's simulation in a minute. But yeah, just let me know what your intuitive response to that is. Looks like everybody can see and hear me okay. Where have we got people from New York City, Orange, New South Wales, Netherlands, UK. So that's a nice mix, worldwide mix. I'm constantly surprised at the time of night that some people are still up and watching YouTube live streams. So thanks to everybody who's here at a weird time. Um, okay, so I need to start by thanking the sponsor of these live streams, which is WeatherGuard Lightning Tech. They make strike tape, a retrofittable lightning protection system for things that go fast, like wind turbine blades and aircraft. So these live streams wouldn't happen without their support. And also the whole Engineering with Rosie channel is supported by my amazing Patreon community. I usually ask them for questions ahead of time about the live streams, but today we had some last minute scheduling, so I didn't do that this time. But hopefully some of you guys are here watching. Okay, so David, can you please tell us a bit about yourself and about why you thought creating your simulation would be a fun way to spend your free time?
Hi, Rosie. Yeah, well, so I've been working in the renewables industry for about 20 years now. Before that, well, actually, it was when I was finishing my PhD here in Canberra. I started working part-time at CSIRO, and the group I was with at CSIRO made maps of the wind, CSIRO is the government scientific organisation here in Australia. And we used to sell those maps mainly to wind farm developers who wanted to find places to build wind farms. And yeah, in 2003, the group I was with spun off as a private company, and I've been with them ever since. And early on in those days of WindLab, one day I came into work and I said, someone's just published a letter to the editor that had all this misinformation about wind energy. And my supervisor at the time said, well, why don't you write a letter back and correct them? And so I did. And pretty much ever since then, I've been, trying not to spend too much time, but at least spending some time trying to correct misinformation about wind energy or renewables in general. And part of that is, often you hear people say, well, because it's not always windy and not always sunny, that we can't get much of our electricity from wind and solar. And, obviously the first part of that's true, but it just got me wondering, well, how easy is it to get, a significant fraction of our electricity from wind and solar? So I just started playing with the data at work whenever I had a spare moment at work. And a few years ago, I published this renewable study at a conference and also on a local website, Renew Economy, just to show that it was quite plausible to get the vast majority of our our electricity from wind and solar. But one thing about that was, that these things get missed by most people, and most people are more interested in what happens recently. They say, well, yesterday there was hardly any wind and there was hardly any sun. What would have we done if we had been mostly powered by renewables? And I thought, well, it'd be nice to have a model that operates in near real time, so that when people say that, we can say, well, actually, if we had a lot more wind and solar, this is what would have happened yesterday. And so about a year ago, I started running the simulation on Twitter, every week I'd say, this is how our grid would look like if we got most of our power from wind and solar. And it's just try to reinforce to people that getting most of our power from wind and solar is actually quite plausible.
Yeah. So I've just brought up the your latest post, and I think we're at 51 weeks now. So that made me. I didn't realize that we should have done this next week. We could have celebrated your 1 year anniversary, a full year of this, and so we'll talk all about all the details of this. But I just wanted to say a little bit about why I thought this would be a cool topic and why I like your simulation, because I mean there's so many 100% renewable simulations or models out there, and one of the things that I do in my work is I'll help clients design an energy storage concept for their their project that they've got, and it's always a matter of, well, do you want to go to what reliability do you want? Do you want 90%, 99%, 99.9%, and you just get this like exponential increase in the amount of storage that you need depending on how constant you need your variable energy, variable renewable electricity supply to be. So, if you can add in just a tiny bit of diesel, or if you've got some flexibility and being able to shut down for a day or two every few years, then you end up with a vastly cheaper system. And so I thought, we've got all this focus on net zero, and we've got all of these 100% renewable models. That's really, really hard. And I don't think people realize how easy it is to get to a mostly renewable system, which we could do really fast and have a better climate outcome by getting to nearly 100% in a decade rather than a literal 100% in maybe 3 decades. So I thought that aspect of what you're doing was cool. And then the second thing is that when I started, I haven't been on Twitter long, and I hate Twitter. I have to admit. I know I love LinkedIn, which is really dorky, and I looked for you on LinkedIn and couldn't even find you. So you're either not on it or not on it much. But you are on Twitter a lot. But since I've been on, the weekly update of your model has been really entertaining, because I found myself watching it like a sporting event, like the Tour de France or something, because for ages it was just like, you can see on the screen there that you give the results of the last week, how renewable it was, and then for the whole simulation, which we said before is up to 51 weeks. And so for ages when I was watching, it was just like 100% renewables, 100% renewables. It was really boring. And then we got into winter, and we started seeing, some other sources of generation come in. So yeah, I thought that was pretty cool. All right, I just want to move a little bit away from the model, and we'll come back to it. I just wanted to come back to some comments. First of all, we've got Luke Appleby calling in from O'Connor ACT, and I didn't mention, but Dave and I are actually also both in the inner north in Canberra, so we're your neighbours, Luke. So hi from very nearby, and yeah, we've got lots of Australians today, which is good, and it makes sense because it is quite an Australian topic. Okay, so I just want to talk about the poll results. So I asked, how much electricity storage duration do you think Australia would need to get to 99% renewable electricity? I said just wind and solar, but I have just found out that I have incorrectly represented Dave's simulation, and there is hydro in there too. We'll talk about how much. So on YouTube, the most popular answer was 50 hours. Second most popular, I don't really want to guess. I just want to see the results. On LinkedIn, we had, kind of evenly spread between 50 hours and 50 days. And then on Twitter, we had 5 hours. But I think I don't think that shows that Twitter people are smarter or anything. I think it's just because most of the people who saw this are people that follow your simulation. That's my take on it, because that is the answer, right? That your model uses 5 hours of energy storage, and you get to, basically you're at by now 99.9% No, 98.8% renewable for the last 51 weeks. So let's call it 99% for a year. So what do you, I'm interested to hear in the comments and also from you, Dave. Were you surprised at those results?
Yeah,
Or
to be
did you?
honest, when
Yeah.
I mean, as mentioned, I have done a bit of, I didn't start modeling this exactly 1 year ago. I'd sort of started playing with the data a lot earlier than that. But obviously when I started, I didn't know whether the coming year was going to be a above average year or below average year. And so I was really expecting around about 98%. So getting closer to 99%. Well, to be honest, really suggests that this year was actually a little bit easier than most years. But
Uh-huh.
yeah, somewhere around 98, 99% is kind of what I expect for most years.
Yeah, I saw your pinned tweet. This is one from 2020 where you've got a 96% renewable simulation, and then that was based on 3 years of actual data. So I guess that was a more challenging year, or yeah,
Yeah,
I'm not
that
sure.
was actually a more sophisticated model where I modeled interconnector limits as well. So that's another reason why it's a bit lower. And we'll probably speak a little bit more about that as one of the limitations of my current model.
Yeah, I mean it's a simple model, right? If you're
Yeah,
updating it every week in your spare time, I don't expect that you've got like a bank of supercomputers that are
yeah,
crunching the numbers. But yeah, let's talk about exactly what it is. How did you end up with this? So my interpretation is that you have taken the existing generation in the Australian grid, which you got from my favorite website, OpenNem. So you just looked at the solar, so it's roof. This is the whole east coast of Australia. Actually, I should show you that. This is the national electricity market grid, all on the whole east coast. So basically all of Australia except for Western Australia and Northern Territory, and I guess some remote communities in here. There aren't a lot of them. I think I read it covers 90% of Australia's population, so it's extensive. And I learned one of the world's longest interconnected power systems, which also makes sense because Australia is a big country and sparsely populated. So it's not like this is maybe representative of other countries. But so you've taken all of the rooftop solar, utility solar, wind, and scaled them up in
yep,
addition to existing hydro
yep.
and batteries as well. Or
Uh, well,
maybe at this
no,
point it's better to let
batteries.
you say what you've done.
Yeah, sure. So as you mentioned, I take the data from OpenNem, and as well as the wind and solar data, I also take demand as well. So I just model demand as it actually was. I keep on getting requests. In the future we're going to electrify cars and heating and all these other things. I should be scaling up demand, and I would like to do that. That's a longer term goal of mine. But for the moment, as soon as you start modifying demand, then you'll have people say, "Oh, well, that's unrealistic. You're expecting a lot of cars to charge in the middle of the day. How are they going to do that?" And also actually just getting a real time series trace of people electrifying heating, for instance, is something I
Mm.
still haven't kind of worked out how I'll do yet. So I thought for the moment I'll just model demand exactly as it was. So at least there's no arguments about me playing with demand and making it easier for renewables to meet. So just
Yeah.
take demand as it was, and then I scale up the solar and wind data. And the way I do that is, actually now, if you just switch to the 1 year view on the OpenNem, you can see over the last year, wind has met 12% of demand. So I'm not sure if you can highlight that. Yeah, just that figure there. Now, from my previous modeling, yeah, in my opinion, a near optimal mix of wind and solar is pretty close to 50-50, with probably a slight bias to wind because it needs less storage. But I mean, the optimal mix is highly dependent on assumptions. So, anywhere around 50-50 is probably pretty reasonable, but in my opinion, a slight bias to wind is probably preferable, well, for the moment. But if solar keeps on coming down in price rapidly and batteries come down in price rapidly, then it may shift back towards solar. But for the time being, I think having a mix of about 60% coming from wind and about 45% coming from solar is kind of near optimal. And I'm sure a lot of people are saying 60 plus 45 is not equal to 100%. And so I guess that's one of the key things is you want to be over generating. You don't want to generate exactly what you need each year and saving every last kilowatt hour from a good day to discharge in a bad day. You want to over generate. And so I've got 105%, which is clearly only a very small amount of over generation. But then when you add, existing hydro provides 7 or 8%. And then, as Rosie mentioned, I'm not aiming for 100%, so I've got a little bit of other generation coming in. So that's just slightly increasing the amount of excess generation I've got each year.
Okay, so you're not scaling up hydro.
No, I'm
no, that would
so
be
one
super hard to convince anybody
yeah,
to dam any
yeah,
more of our national parks to expand beyond what we've got, I think.
yeah. So just clarifying it, with hydro, Australia is very lucky in that its hydro is highly dispatchable, and what I mean by that is the vast majority of it comes out of large storage dams, and so it means the operator can pretty much switch it on or off, whenever they want to. They're not, the amount of hydro generation is not, to a large extent, it's not controlled by how much water is currently flowing in a river. There's, for nearly all the hydro generation, they have big dams, in some cases storing, a year of generation or more, 2 years of generation in the dams. So you can, if you have a lot of water in your rivers, that doesn't mean you need to run hydro hard in that week. It can all be stored. And so when I say I keep hydro at existing levels, I do shift it around. So I no longer discharge it when it was discharged last week, but because it is highly dispatchable, I can say, well, actually, we didn't need it on Tuesday. I'm going to keep hydro down to a minimum level, but we really needed it on Thursday night. And so I'll shift that hydro generation around, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
But on an annual basis, I'll keep it about the same, which is sort of 7 to 8% of our needs.
All right. So I don't know if there's questions, viewer questions about the model, or if that's pretty clear what you've done there. We've got one question from the unknown unknowns. Would vehicle to grid salt the last 2%? Maybe that's a question for the end. But we should talk about how much storage is required, because so you've scaled up all of these wind and solar, and so if we look here, actually, should I go to the presentation, because you've got it nice and big?
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah.
So
the black line is demand, right? Real demand.
Yep. So that hasn't been changed.
Yeah, and so because we've gone past 100%, we've got all of this is curtailed. You're generating all of this and you don't need to use it all. Is that right?
Yeah. So if we start, actually, do you want to just go back one more slide just to explain how I've scaled it up?
Yeah.
So
cool.
as we saw before, over the last 12 months, wind has been 12%. My target is 60%, so I've just scaled it up by a factor of 5. But I should say each week, the 12 months that we've just seen, that 12% is changing slowly. So each week, my scale factors change a little bit. So when I started a year ago, the scale factor for wind was about 5.3, and over the last 12 months, it's come down to 5 times, and that's because we've built more wind farms in that 12-month period. So I don't need to scale it up quite as much, and the same with the rooftop solar and utility solar scale factors. but that's essentially the idea of how it works. I use what's happened over the last 12 months to determine the scale factor, grab the data from OpenWind as it's shown there, and then if we go to the next slide, this is the data once I've applied those scale factors.
Okay, just let me go quickly
Yeah.
back to here. You've got rooftop solar, you're scaling by 2.9 times. I know we're at like 25 to 30% of households in Australia have rooftop solar, so we can't go much beyond beyond what you've got
Yeah.
here, right? That would
Actually,
take us to nearly everyone. Yeah.
yeah, well, I mean, we can actually, because every year the average installation size is going up.
Oh yeah, true.
Like for example, I put solar on my roof about a decade ago, and I've got a small 2 kilowatt system, whereas the average installation these days is about 8 kilowatts. So even though we're already up at 30% or
Uh-huh.
so of homes, the remaining 70% will probably put a much bigger system in than the first 30%. So
Yeah.
that's one
All right.
factor. But another factor is that there's so many big warehouses that don't have rooftop solar at the moment, and I gather that's one of the biggest growth areas for rooftop solar at the moment is these
Mm.
commercial installations. And I've seen studies that suggest Australia could fit 140 gigawatts, I think it was, of rooftop solar, uh, which is a 10-time increase over what we
Wow.
currently have. If we just start putting solar on on all our um, possible homes, as well as all the possible warehouses and businesses.
Yeah. Okay. So, I mean, when you look at the numbers, and given that Australia really, was not a leader in renewable energy, I mean, other than maybe rooftop solar, you could call us a leader. I know we're installing faster than any other country in the world per capita at the moment, so that's good for us now. But they don't seem that it's not implausible, right? Of course, we'll end up with 5 times the wind that we have now. Of course, will more people will put rooftop solar in because you make money or you save money in the long run from doing it. So, it makes me. I think it's a really positive story. But anyway,
Yeah,
let's move on
yeah,
to what you were trying to say about
sure.
the model.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. So if we I guess start at the left-hand end. So this is a simulation I just ran today. So it starts a week ago on the 11th of August. And you can see for those first few hours, the wind and solar is above demand. But if you look at the lower graph, storage was already at full capacity when we started this week, and that's because last week it finished at full capacity. So all that excess solar in that graph is just being curtailed at the moment. And then as we get to the end of the solar day, you can see that red patch, which is where the storage is being discharged. And so that's why you see the graph below. It's suddenly reducing below full capacity as it's filling that gap between the renewable supply and demand. And then there's a little patch when the red patch ends. There's a dotted line, and that indicates that the storage is being recharged again, because you can see just wind alone during the night was exceeding demand, and so we're able to recharge the storage a little bit. And then likewise, when we get to that next day, solar ramps up again, and you see that dotted line appearing again, and we manage to recharge the storage back up to 100%. And then the next day you have a big red patch, and you can see the storage level goes all the way down, almost down to zero. And that's not a coincidence. The way my simulation works is it tries to run it without any hydro or any other. And if the storage goes negative, then it knows it has to discharge a bit more hydro or other to stop it going negative. And so you'll often see my model where the storage gets pretty close to zero, and it's not a coincidence. That's the way it's designed. And that reminds me, my model assumes 24 hours perfect foresight of the wind, the solar, and the demand. And obviously we don't have perfect foresight, but we actually do have pretty good forecasting ability 24 hours. It's very similar to the weather forecast. The weather forecast 24 hours ahead is usually pretty accurate. So too is the forecast of wind, solar, and demand. And so that's why I feel reasonably okay with my model assuming 24 hours perfect foresight.
Okay. So you've got
Yeah.
here. Can I just talk about some features? I don't think you can't see my mouse pointing, can you? I don't know how to do that. So let's just I'll just describe it. But the flat line at the top, the blue line in the bottom section of the graph, that's storage state of charge, right?
Yep.
And looks like you're going up to 120,000 megawatt hours.
Yep.
How did you arrive at that amount of storage, and can you put that in context for us?
Yeah. So so for so 120 megawatt hours represents about 5 hours of average NEM demand. So average NEM demand is around 23 gigawatts. So just as a result of the playing with the data over the last few years, I've kind of arrived at 4 to 5 hours as being a rough ballpark of how much short-term storage you need to manage things on an intraday basis. So basically shifting excess solar from the middle of the day towards the night is kind of the main thing. And if this is a model that's 60% wind, 45% solar, if we reverse that and made it a bias towards solar, then we'd probably need a little bit more of this intraday storage, short-term storage, to shift the solar towards the night. But 4 to 5 hours is kind of a rough ballpark of how much short-term storage is needed to get us most of the way to 100% renewables. As another ballpark, averaged over the year, the storage is averaging about half a cycle per day. And that's, I guess, one of the things about storage is for it to be economic, you want it to be used reasonably often. And so I could have put in, a higher level of storage, maybe twice as much, and we'd get closer to 100% renewables. But realistically speaking, that extra 120 gigawatt hours of storage isn't used that often and is really unlikely to be economic, unless we have a really high carbon price or something else that's forcing us to get to 100% renewables. Whereas 120 gigawatt hours is kind of a quite feasible amount for us.
So we've got currently planned the Snowy Hydro 2.0. Well, it's not planned; it's being built.
Yeah.
There's tunnels, tunnels being bored, and a lot happening. Do you? I can look it up, but do you happen to remember the capacity that that's going to
Yeah.
bring on?
Yeah. So Snowy 2.0 is 2 gigawatts in power and 350,000 megawatt hours. So it's
Okay.
almost 3 times the storage capacity is what my model uses. But the fact that it's only 2 gigawatts, is not enough power for my model. If you look at the graph above, you can see that often that dotted line representing charging is 20 gigawatts above the demand line. And likewise, the red areas are often 10, 15 gigawatts below the demand line. So you really need, in the case of my simulation, I'm using 24 gigawatts. So even though Snowy 2.0 has heaps of capacity, it doesn't have the power requirements to help us get most of the way to 100% renewables.
Do you think you can get around that with some batteries and do like storage to storage charging?
Yeah. Uh, to be honest, not really. I mean, it only minor tinkering. So what my apologies, my baby has just pushed into the
That's okay.
room. um, so get my model is 98.8% renewable energy. The Snowy 2.0 is a good solution for some of that last 1.2%. It's a form of long-term storage, and that's what we
Yeah.
need to get rid of that last 1.2%. But it's not particularly useful for this intraday stuff, which is what is needed to get us up to 98, 99% renewable.
Okay. So then maybe that's a good time to come back to that question, which I'm struggling. Oh, yeah, here it is. would vehicle to grid sort the last 2%? And yeah, that's a topic I've covered on the channel before. One of my favorites, where you use electric vehicles that are plugged into charge, you put them on two-way smart chargers, and as well as taking electricity from the grid, they can also supply it.
Yep.
What do you think about that? Is
It,
that
w-
going
it,
to
w-
be a big thing?
uh, so, I mean, I'm not convinced vehicle to grid is going to be a big thing, but I am convinced smart charging will be a big thing. And so, yeah, if we increase our demand by 30% by everyone switching to electric cars, um, then obviously we need more renewables, more wind and solar to meet that extra 30%. Um, but if we're able to charge our cars in a smart way, and so that means having as many of them as possible available to charge during the middle of the day. And for those that can't charge during the middle of the day, if they just charge on the nights that are windy, and nearly every week we have a night that's windy. So, obviously there needs to be some sort of a price signal to encourage people to charge. Um, and there's pretty illogical way of doing that, because whenever it's a windy night, the electricity price is pretty cheap. So if there's just some pass through of those cheap prices through to households to encourage them to charge on these windy nights, then it'll greatly help us get closer to 100% renewables. But I don't think it won't be enough to get us all the way, but it'll help us with that last couple of percent.
Yeah. Okay. Um, all right. I'm just trying to go through the comments. There's a lot, which is great. Keep them coming, but it's hard for me to keep track. I did want to talk about. Oh, I want to show in this one we've got a tiny little bit of other
Yep.
coming in, but I'm trying to find. Do you happen to know of a slide that has a lot of other on
Yeah.
it I can go to?
Yep.
I'll just keep cycling through. And
Yep.
so what I got, this is, yeah, the start.
Yeah.
So it's about this
So,
time last year, a little
yep.
later than this
Yeah.
last
And
year.
actually,
So
you can see
winter.
the very second
Oh
night
yeah,
of my
there.
simulation. Um,
Yeah.
yeah. So it was. I didn't deliberately start at a particular time of year. It was just, I started to think. I eventually worked out a way to make the simulation really nice and easy for me to do, so that I could update it every week. So I started a year ago, and on the second night, we can see there's a very challenging night because there's very little wind. Um, yeah, I ran hydro really hard during the night, but I have a limit on how much hydro you can dispatch,
Mm.
which I limit it to 6 gigawatts. We actually have about 8 gigawatts of hydro in Australia, but not all of it is associated with big dams and is highly dispatchable. But so kind of 6 gigawatts is a reasonable approximation for how much is highly dispatchable and could be run hard during the night. But
Mm.
that wasn't enough, and so I needed to use this other. And so my model, it doesn't exactly specify what other is. In the short term, it's just likely to be our existing peaking gas generators, but obviously we want that to transition to a zero carbon option in the future. But yeah, you can see on that second night, there's several gigawatts of other being dispatched during the night to stop the storage going negative, essentially.
Yeah. Okay. And what does other mean?
Yeah. So as mentioned in the, I mean, other is it's non-specified, but it is a highly flexible dispatchable generator, and at the moment, a peaking gas power plant is pretty much the exact fits that perfectly.
Yeah.
Something that can be switched on quickly, something that you can just run a handful of times per year. It runs at a very low capacity factor, so obviously it would have to charge quite a lot to justify its existence. But on Australia, we already have over 10 gigawatts of peaking gas or diesel generators,
Mm.
and so we already have them. So it seems like a logical solution in the short to medium term is we keep those to get through these tough
Do we
nights where there's.
do we ever have we ever needed more than what we've got currently in Australia? So I'm trying to say, do we need any more new
Yep.
gas peaker
Yep.
plants? projects, like the one
Yeah.
that's planned to
Well,
go ahead?
actually, so later on in the simulation, and I'm not sure if you want to fast forward through to it, but it was actually just a few weeks ago. Um, so,
Okay, well, I'll just jump
oh,
right down then, even though it would be cool
okay,
to
yep,
just flick through it all. But
yep.
um,
There we
this
go.
one,
Peak other. Yep.
yeah,
So you can see
uh-huh.
it was the night of 12th of July. So yeah, just over a month ago. Um, we had essentially our toughest day of the year to get through in this mostly renewable simulation, and other peaked at 6.6 gigawatts. And so, as mentioned before, we've got about 10 gigawatts of peaking gas or diesel plants at the moment. So, plenty to cover that 6.6 gigawatts. But having said that, this year does look like it might have been a bit easier than previous years. And so I think, if realistically, it's going to be pretty close to whether our existing gas, at around 10 gigawatts, is about the right capacity. It's possible we may need a little bit more to
Hmm.
get through a really challenging night.
Well, I guess by the time that we, you know, um, what have we got to do? Triple our rooftop solar and get 5 times the
Yeah,
wind. By the time we get there, you will have more years of your simulation, and of course,
yeah,
you could rerun it with stochastic data. You could, do some statistical tricks to, do 200 or 2,000 or whatever you want years of simulation and
yeah,
see how often you would find yourself short. If it probably wouldn't be that hard. You could do that
yeah.
over the weekend probably.
Yeah, and actually that probably brings me to, you mentioned before, there's quite a lot of 100% renewable simulations around,
Mm.
and I guess one of the things that's different about mine is first of all, it's not aiming for 100% because it knows that last few percent is quite difficult, and at the
Mm-hmm.
moment we're not entirely sure what's going to be the best solution, um, but that high 90% is quite plausible.
Mm.
But the other thing that differentiates my studies from most of the other ones is that it's just using actual generation data, whereas most of the other studies all use simulated data. And the and so people, I guess, uh, sometimes are skeptical about simulated data,
Mm.
whereas actual generation data, it's obviously showing what happened. It incorporates breakdowns which happen. Substations have to switch off. It's real data, so it's a little bit more believable in that way. But the
Mm.
problem with using real data is we have had wind and solar farms in Australia for 10, 20 years, sort of thing. But to get this kind of simulation working, we need good geographic representation. We need wind across as many of the states as possible, solar across as many of the states as possible. And it's only recently that we've really had wind starting to appear in any significant quantity in Queensland. And we might come back to that later, perhaps. But
Mm.
Queensland wind in particular is quite different to wind in the other states. And so I could try to run my simulation using the last decade of data, but it wouldn't really work well if you go back too far because we don't have good geographic representation of all the states. And
Yes. Climate's changing as well. I know that's a problem that they're having
yeah,
in around the
mm,
UK. Offshore wind farms are sometimes not seeing the wind that they expected.
yeah,
So that's a challenge. But what I really like about the fact that you're using real data and in real time is that, you update this every week and oh, it was really cold this week or it was really windy or, whatever. You kind of get more of a intuitive sense um, for how it works with the weather. So maybe you remember, since this was a standout week, was this the week where we had problems. We had a lot of problems with the national electricity market about a month, or maybe it was longer ago. They had a whole bunch of
yep,
problems with the reliability with coal power plants and flooded coal mines, and the
yep,
gas price went really high, and all sorts of things. I don't want to get too much into
yeah.
that now, but was this?
It was actually the early June where we had those problems. So actually,
Oh,
if you go
okay.
back one slide, Because I remember there was a lot of analysis saying, we had all these coal power outages that happened to coincide with an early start to winter, a high demand, and also poor wind and solar. And I always thought that was a bit harsh, because if you look at the start of June, we had sensational wind. There were some occasional bad patches, but we were really lucky. This critical fortnight, it kind of started around the 1st of June and hit a crisis at the 15th of June. And you can see the 13th of June, there wasn't great wind. So, so perhaps that one day of poor wind helped catalyze the crisis. But in terms of the 15-day duration of the crisis, we were extraordinarily lucky that we had great wind.
Yeah, I mean it's true in Australia, and I think it's true in the US and probably a lot of the world, that it doesn't matter what the energy crisis is, that renewables are going to be the ones to blame. It's either because there wasn't, also wind couldn't save us from coal's failures because we didn't have enough wind, so we should never install more wind. That's kind of the argument that I kind of interpret from some of the conservative anti-renewables types. It's you're always going to get blamed. I've gotten used to that now.
Yep.
Yeah. Maybe this is a good time there's been some good questions that are pretty relevant. First of all, from Joan Cone, red green colorblind guy here. Hard to see the green next to the red. Sorry about that. Maybe next time you're changing the colors. I don't know if there's a special color palette that you can use that's better for colorblind people. Then what did I want? Oh yeah, from Win Lingia. Can the last part be biomass or waste incineration? And we could add to that. Could it be hydrogen? Could it be I don't know, any number of new? You can obviously, there are other ways to make this other category aside from fossil fuels, right? So it could be a 100% renewable scenario if you just say that other is some sort of dispatchable zero emissions fuel.
Yeah, so Australia currently gets, I think it's just under 1% from biomass, but at the moment that is run more of a base load kind of thing I think it's during the cropping season for sugar or something like that.
So I think a lot of farms are using it for their own needs, just to purely save themselves money.
Yeah, so we definitely need to change how the biomass was used in order for it to fill in. We'd have to stockpile all these sugarcane residue or whatever, and then burn it in a peaking plant rather than a more something that's less suitable to stopping and starting. But certainly biofuels is an option. As you see, Kevin, looks like could a diesel generator powered by waste vegetable oil work economically? I mean, I'm not qualified to answer that. It seems like a valid option, good potential option, but in terms
there's some guy who owns a pub along or I don't know if it's a pub, it's a rest stop anyway on the Nullarbor somewhere.
Yes.
And he has he's got a biodiesel generator that he is providing for electric vehicle owners to be able to charge up when they're in I don't know how many thousand kilometers it is without petrol or electricity, grid electricity there. So certainly can be done. I don't know about the economics. Yeah.
I mean, so I guess there's a couple of things that I think are potential for other. So one thing is, if Australia becomes a hydrogen superpower in exporting hydrogen, and as a result, we have to massively increase our generation to meet this large increase in demand. If we increased Australia's demand by about 80%, but that extra 80% was highly flexible, and so most of the ideas for generating hydrogen are using these PEM electrolyzers, which are fairly flexible. So if we increased the amount of wind and solar to essentially be 180% of annual demand rather than just 105% of demand, then pretty much even on the worst day we'd have enough wind and solar to meet existing demand, assuming we can shut those electrolyzers down to zero on those days. So that's one good potential for getting rid of that last couple of percent is if we massively ramp up our demand to power these hydrogen electrolyzers, we may not need other. But if we don't increase our demand by that much, then hydrogen's still a potential. Because if we can use hydrogen-powered generators, either fuel cells or just a regular generator powered by hydrogen, that's definitely a key contender to help us out on these nights when we'd have poor wind.
I'm personally, I mean, I'm so not worried about the 1% of gas left because it's like then we can focus our attention on the low hanging fruit and other areas, like electrifying a lot more. And of course, a lot of the new electrical loads that we plan to add, like for transport, is at least going to be flexible. If you get there won't be 100% electric vehicles if there's not smart charging. There's just no way that's going to, it just can't work like that. So, we'll at least be able to control when the demand is to match better those peaks and probably see less curtailment than what we do now. And, agriculture is a, big source of emissions. We can focus attention there once we really quickly get to somewhere in the 90% renewable electricity. I don't see that we need to, if hydrogen is not cheap at that point, if whatever, we'll leave that in the research phase and then move on to some of the other low hanging fruits. So that's why I like your simulation so much. I just want to quickly sidetrack us. So maybe this is a mistake. Gelling like a felon. Why no nuclear? Is this the topic that you want to get into?
I mean, I'm happy to. Certainly, there's plenty of
There's
comments
one
on
suggested
my Twitter
answer from Kaiser Usam. Scared boomers ruined nuclear for several decades, and I mean the short answer is it's illegal in Australia. We don't have any, I guess. Do you want to say any more about it, and you can feel free to say no.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, it is I do hope to have another simulation that incorporates nuclear, but I'm not sure if we'll get to this. But I've got an estimate of my simulation as providing electricity at about $83 a megawatt hour.
I'll find that.
If we. That's
I
near
can't
the
even see them.
end. There we go.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we can see I've costed the wind, the solar, the hydro, the other, costed the batteries, costed the extra transmission, and all up you get to a figure that's about $83 a megawatt hour. And that's meeting supply and demand at every hour of the day. There is an active nuclear community here in Australia who reckon at some point in the future we'll be able to get nuclear at around about that price, but that's being nuclear run at a high capacity factor, essentially run as a base load. I
just wanted to show the average over the last year was $170.77 apparently. So
so to put that 83 in context,
so it doesn't sound like a bad thing to swap to 99% renewables then.
So $83 a megawatt hour. I mean, it's more expensive than electricity was 10 years ago. It's more expensive than it was just a couple of years ago, because we actually had quite cheap electricity a couple of years ago, and actually it was actually getting a bit difficult for wind and solar developers because the wholesale price was so low that people were less keen to sign PPAs with wind and solar farms. But all that changed about a year ago, and the prices shot up, and now everyone wants to sign a PPA with wind and solar farms and get some cheaper power. So $83 a megawatt hour, it's a pretty good competitive price, and as far as I can see, nuclear is unlikely to be able to match that, particularly when you're when you're having to ramp the nuclear, because demand is highly variable. It's going up to 36 gigawatts in the peak of summer, and some days it's going down as low as 16 gigawatts. And if you have to ramp nuclear to match demand, then it's already starting off pretty expensive, and then when you're curtailing it, you're just making it more and more expensive. So for the moment, I find it. I'm dubious that nuclear will ever be able to compete with renewables plus 5 hours of storage.
Yeah. Okay. We're running out of time. So I just want to get to a few topics that I think are, well, I mean, yeah, I could easily talk for another hour. I find this really interesting. And obviously, this is a lot more comments than we normally get. So I think that this is an interesting topic in general. I want to talk about curtailment. And there was a comment about curtailment. And I'm sorry, I'm not going to be able to find it again. So I won't be able to read out your name. But thank you for the comment about curtailment. How much have you got in this, and why is it at that level? Why haven't you chosen to have more storage so that you never have to curtail anything? Because that's just a waste of our precious energy.
Yeah, so in my model, I've currently got 18 to 19% of the wind and
Yeah.
solar has, yep, that's the graph there. If you look at that very last column, excess generation, a bit over 18% of the wind and solar wasn't needed and was curtailed. And so if you're starting off with wind and solar, being around $50 a megawatt hour, if you add an extra 20% to that to account for the fact that you're not curtailing 20% of it, then that's getting you up to $60 a megawatt hour, or perhaps a little bit more. And that's still pretty cheap. And obviously, wind and solar, well, is generally speaking is coming down pretty rapidly in price. Maybe not the last year, but other than the occasional volatility, which might see a year increase, it's still in general coming down each year. So adding 20% to your cost because you're curtailing 18% or so is pretty easy pill to swallow. Now, obviously, I could have more and more wind and solar and more excess generation just to reduce the amount of other. But realistically speaking, it's to reduce that other from 1.3% to 0.5% or something. You're having to generate a lot of wind and solar just to get rid of that last bit of other. And so I've kind of stopped where I think is a reasonable economic spot to stop.
And what about on the other end? Because I know people hate curtailment, and every time I'm at a renewable energy conference, people always talk about it like the goal is to have just zero wasted energy. And I always think it's so weird because you don't design a coal power plant to always run at 100% capacity. You design it for your peak peak demand that you're ever going to want. Same with transmission lines. You don't size those for your average day, or so that they've always chock full of electrons. You size them for the very worst day that you're going to have ever. So I don't really understand why people are so obsessed with wanting no curtailment. But in general, I think the most common attitude that I hear, at least from non-engineers, is that we shouldn't be wasting anything. That's a lot of why people really want hydrogen to be a thing to, soak up these peaks and fill in troughs. So you could have just increased other or storage and got rid of the excess generation. You could get that close to zero. Why not that?
Yeah, well, I mean, I agree completely with you, Rosie. Some amount of excess generation is the economic solution, the optimal economic solution. I've gone with about 18%, but there's a fair bit of range that could plausibly be the optimal solution. But the thing about obviously a wind and solar developer doesn't like curtailment, but the main thing is they want to know, when they're building it and financing it, they want to be able to know in advance how much is going to be curtailed, because if they finance a project assuming 0% curtailment and then they have 5% curtailment, then it can completely wipe out their profits. But if they've known in advance that curtailment's going to be 10, 20% or whatever, and they finance accordingly, then it's much more manageable. It's just when the curtailment is a little bit less predictable that it becomes an issue.
Yeah, I know when I've designed, grid concepts for clients, and they're always off grid. These ones that I do, and it's one person paying the bill for the whole thing. I'll do a simple economic optimization, and I always end up with 20 or 30% curtailment. It depends on where you are. If you've got good solar and wind resources, then you need a lot less curtailment than if you've only got wind or only got solar. That's the cheapest system overall, but then they don't have to worry about every developer making a profit and every retailer making a profit. And I think that my interpretation as an engineer, not a finance person, is that the financials of the market are kind of getting in the way of the optimal engineering solution. Do you think that that's just because I don't understand finance, or is that the impression you get too?
Yeah, I mean, well, obviously every company is trying to maximize its profit and doesn't like curtailment because it's reducing their profit. But I think just reinforcing what I said before, if they can live with expected curtailment, but if curtailment's more than they planned, then it can really hurt a company's profit. So it's unexpected curtailment that's the really hurtful thing.
Yeah. Okay, we are going to have to wrap up soon. I'll ask a few of the more interesting viewer questions, but one thing we didn't talk about, I don't think, is transmission. So I'll just go back and share that that map of the national electricity market. Where is it? Yeah. So yeah, we've got 5,000 kilometers. I think more than 5,000 kilometers of connected transmission lines. What have you assumed with transmission? Obviously, the current system is not designed for 5 times the number of wind farms wherever a developer wants to put them. Have you done anything with transmission, or you just assume that the electrons can get from where they're generated to where they need to be consumed, that the transmission will be sorted?
Yep. Yeah. No, so the latter. This is a very simple model. I haven't modeled flow on transmission lines, in particular the interconnectors, and so it's a little bit optimistic in that aspect. So if I had have incorporated those constraints, then my 99% might be 97% or something like that. Mm-hmm. And you're very right that we will need a lot more transmission to connect 6 times or 5 times more wind. Thankfully, our electricity market operator is on top of that, and there's some pretty solid plans going forward for building transmission to connect these renewable energy zones, which is where we're going to fit all these new wind and solar farms, as well as increasing the amount of rooftop solar.
Okay. One other thing I want to talk about, we don't have much time to, but how you're seeing things change, because I know that we're really lucky in Australia that the wind in Queensland is not blowing typically at the same time as the wind in South Australia. So, and Queensland, it's not got a lot of wind at the moment, right? Do you see that having an effect?
Yeah, so I've done analysis of correlation of wind in various states, and a decade ago, nearly all our wind was in South Australia, Victoria, and a little bit in southern New South Wales, and also a couple in Tasmania. Now, all of those were fairly highly correlated. They're all, with the exception of the Tasmanian ones, they're all at a pretty similar latitude. And that's one of the things about wind is if you're at the similar latitude, you tend to get the same storm systems passing through. But Tasmania being a lot further south and Queensland being a lot further north, they have quite different wind regimes. And so just in the last year or two, we've had a couple more wind farms being built in Tasmania, and now we're just starting to get a spate of wind farms being built in Queensland, and they will really help. I'm not saying the main thing is they're not very well correlated. So it's not really true to say that it's often windy in those states when it's not windy in the other ones, but there's often just zero correlation. So there's a 50% chance you'll have really good wind in those during those difficult days in Victoria and South Australia, but there's also a 50% chance it'll be poor wind in those states as well. But a 50% chance is a lot better than 0%. And so it really just means it reduces the amount of other, essentially. You still need to have the gigawatt capacity of other to cope for those days when it's poor wind in all of them. But it just reduces the number of days that other has to be deployed.
Okay. And there were some comments earlier on that I won't be able to find, so sorry to those commenters, about what's going to happen when offshore wind is added. So, I mean, I guess it's still not certain that we'll get some offshore wind, but there are at least there's progress happening with some, Victorian offshore wind farms, and I mean there's plans for offshore all around, but let's assume that we're gonna first of all have some offshore wind in this kind of area. And I know that one of the things that they're pitching, Star of the South especially, is I think the by far the most advanced in their plans. One of the reasons that they're suggesting that this is a great project to go ahead is that the wind pattern's different offshore, and they say that it's much more correlated with demand. They get a lot of wind in the evenings, apparently, in their site. Do you have an opinion about that? Obviously, it doesn't show up in the data yet because we don't have any offshore wind to scale, but...
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't have an informed opinion. I'm looking forward to getting some data. And there's simulated data, but simulated data is generally not very high resolution. And so if a wind farm's just 5 or 10 kilometers offshore, the simulated data is probably not accurate enough to show whether it does have a different wind pattern to a wind farm that's just onshore. So it's not really till we see accurate data that we'll be able to verify that. But having said that, offshore is likely to have a higher capacity factor, and obviously the higher the capacity factor, that certainly helps.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. I'm not sure they even have any physical, like, do you put met masts in the ocean? Is that how you measure an
actually,
offshore wind farm? I don't think
yeah,
they've got anything physical installed yet. So
yeah, no, actually, I saw a media release just a few days ago that I think they've just retrieved a LiDAR that's been taking wind
they do?
measurements
Oh, okay.
offshore.
Well, at least that's
Yeah,
something.
so not a mast, but yeah, LiDARs, I think.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. Well, let's just run quickly through some quick question and answers, and then we'll wrap up. So, Niels Beaufort, and I don't know if that's your real name, but it's very appropriate to the wind topic. Have you open sourced your simulation, or could you maybe share it? I'd like to adapt it to work for the Netherlands or maybe the EU.
No, I haven't, and part of the
Is it a
problem is,
spreadsheet or what is it?
to be
What's
honest,
it
it's just an
for?
Excel file with a
Yeah.
VBA script. So I just click a
Yeah.
button and it goes ahead and runs.
Yeah.
But it is at the moment it is not suitable for open sourcing because it's a mess and my coding is terrible, and it would take you forever to work out how to use it. And also some parts of it are highly specific to Australia, like trying to decide how to dispatch the hydro and things. So it would take a fair bit of effort to make it usable for someone else, and it may not even be that useful for some places that because of that Australia's hydro and being highly dispatchable. Yeah. So unfortunately, the answer for that is no, and unlikely to.
Okay, but maybe if someone comes with some funds, that could be a project to adapt it. Okay, Smooth Jamie, I like that name. I'd be interested to see how a model like this would work for the UK. There's great interest in heat pumps on top of EV charging would be an added load on the grid. I want to say something about this. I just say for you could say this for any different country, and I think you can't look at Dave's model and be like 99% renewables is easy with 5 hours of storage everywhere. I personally think Australia probably has it the easiest out of anywhere in the world in terms of just having, such a large geographically separated grid or already there. So much wind and solar, sparse population, so we don't, using a lot of energy for how much is, like blowing across and falling on our land naturally. So I know that Dave, obviously you can't just adapt your model to the UK, but if you could, I expect that you would not end up with 99% with 5 hours of storage. I don't know if you have any desire to guess at what you would end up with for the UK.
No, I'd probably making a fool of myself. Yeah, but I agree completely. Australia is going to be much easier than nearly every other country. In addition to the reasons you mentioned, the other thing is our demand is not very seasonal. Well, it is a little bit seasonal, but it's slightly summer peaking. So if you have a winter peak demand, then it's going to make things harder because obviously that doesn't correspond well with solar. And so clearly all these far northern European countries are going to have problems with because their demand is so much higher in winter, whereas in Australia it tends to be a little bit higher in summer than winter. And that problem's even going to get worse when we start electrifying some of this heating.
Yeah. Okay. I'm just quickly running through the ends of the comments. There's so many good ones. We'll have to have you back. I don't know at some point. But yeah, this has been a really good topic. Although David Lee says getting more comments due to the time of day. It depends because usually the time of day I choose is nice for Australian and US viewers. I think this one is good for Australia and on an Australian topic, and good for Europe. So maybe Europeans are more happy to comment. I can't read all the I can't read all the comments, but yeah. One comment about Saul Griffith, do yourself a favour and look him up. I did read his book recently and have spoken to him. I would love to have him on the show to talk about his plans to electrify Australia. Okay, so we might leave it there then. And thanks for all the extra comments. And sorry we can't get to them all. Yeah, I could talk about this for a lot longer, but I know that I promised Dave it would only be an hour and it's been longer. So we'll wrap up there. Thanks again to WeatherGuard Lightning Tech for sponsoring the live stream. WeatherGuard also has a great tech newsletter and a podcast, which I co-host each week. So the links to that are in the description. We talk about clean energy tech news. In the latest episode of the podcast, we talked about floating wind and floating solar. I don't know if you have an opinion about that, Dave. I am puzzled by floating solar. I continue to be puzzled. I used to be puzzled by offshore wind, and now I'm on board. So maybe it's just I'm slow. What do you think? You excited about it?
About solar in particular, floating solar in particular?
Floating solar.
Yeah, well, I mean, to be honest, I don't have a particularly informed view. I would have thought anything that's subject to big waves is going to be problematic, as we've seen with all the wave generators that seem to get damaged in big storms. I find it hard to believe a big solar farm wouldn't get. But if you're in a nice protected lake or reservoir that doesn't have big waves, then that's particularly in a country like Australia, if it's reducing evaporation, then that's fantastic.
I can imagine it combined well with pumped hydro, but maybe it's because, in Australia we have so much land, we've got no shortage of land, we'll never run out of land to put solar panels, never ever. And our oceans are have very big waves, which is great if you like surfing, compared to a lot of other places. So maybe that's why we don't get it, because Australia is like the last place you'd put it probably. Anyway, got sidetracked. So yeah, check out that podcast in your favorite podcast app, or you can watch it here on YouTube, and I put all the links in the description. I also need to thank again the Engineering with Rosie Patreon team for their support. Link is also in the description there, and I'll put a link up now on the screen. And you can watch out for the next couple of videos. There'll be a video out next week on regenerative braking and a mining train project that sounds like a perpetual motion device, but isn't. That's a Twiggy Andrew Forrest project. I don't know, you might have heard of that one, Dave. So that's kind of cool. We do some calculations to look at whether it's possible or just a crazy thought explosion out of Twiggy's head, which there are frequently. And then, there are some more live streams coming up. One's going to be on EV charging, like for road trips. And then there's going to be one on sustainable space as well. So, biggest thank you to Dave and to everyone who's watching. And we'll see you in the next video. See you.
Thanks, all. Bye.